First of all, welcome. My name's Adam Foreman. I'm the executive director here at Shadows. This is the second program in our military history series. Last time we met, it was on Louisiana's contributions to the Second World War. Today, it's the Bayou Teche Campaign during the Civil War. Our next program is going to be our Arts and Crafts Festival coming up in October? And then Farm Fest, which is September. If anyone would like to volunteer for Farm Fest, please let me know. We're looking for volunteers. It takes about 100 volunteers to run the program, and we are in need of those because we still want to continue providing this to our community, but we absolutely need the support and manpower for it, okay? Tonight is a very special kickoff. Our very good friends at Cane River Pecan Company has challenged us to a donation match. They are donating $1,000 to the Shadows, and they've challenged us to raise an additional $1,000 to double the impact of the gift. So if you're interested in giving $5, $10, whatever you'd like, your donation will be doubled. Cane River Pecan Company down the street. CJ at the desk. We're more than happy to give you more information about this challenge. Okay. Tonight's speaker is a gifted teacher from Paul.
Edgar Martin. We were at Paulboro. We got moved to Edgar Martin a little over a year ago.
We talked too much is what we did.
Yes.
Edgar Martin, Lauren, he did a really fantastic series on the Bayou Teche campaign. And our program series, if you've noticed, has been really trying to connect story and place together. We connected Louisiana to the Second World War. Here we're connecting our region to the Civil War. And Lauren took that really literally and went to the actual battlefields and to the spaces and recorded the history while standing in those spaces. So he's going to tell us about the Bayou Teche campaign. So welcome.
Here we go. I actually teach, we're good. There we go. I actually teach science. So like whenever they ask me to do this, and actually if you've seen videos on my YouTube channel, I'm like, actually, if you want to know about swamps and wetland protection structures like this thing. So actually I did this kind of on a whim, and I'll talk about this in a second. But the title, of course, is Yankees in the Garden of Eden. This is the spring 1863 Bayou Teche campaign. Going into this, I actually did not know about the spring Bayou Teche campaign because whenever I was young, the only thing I knew about the Civil War in the area was that the Yankees came rolling through in the fall because there was the book Yankee Autumn in Acadiana, if any of you have read that book, by David Edmonds, which his story is really funny because he was an architecture professor at UL. He buys this old house, he finds something in the attic from the Civil War, and he's like, wait, I didn't know anything, and he ends up doing all of this research on it with this. So like I start reading about that, and then I find out that there's a spring campaign where they march through the same things in the first time. I'm like, whoa, hang on. And so it led to a 3-video series. So we're gonna go through this. So in the Civil War in Louisiana by 1863, we were really, really popular with the Union at the beginning of the war because New Orleans, after minimal resistance, was captured by the Union. And the thing to know is that New Orleans was by far the largest city in the South. In fact, it was bigger than the next 9 cities in the South combined. So it would have been like if there was some sort of war and like they show up in New York and New York immediately surrenders. Like that would be a huge hit for, for the United States. As a result of this, the Union moved up the Mississippi River. The Louisiana state government abandons Baton Rouge. They go across to Opelousas, where they set up their state capital. In fact, they were set up at the Lacombe Hotel, which is still there. The second video I have, actually I recorded under the hotel. It's still there. So that's where they had their government. But there was one sticking point for the Union. It was the fortress at the earthworks at Port Hudson, which is about 9-10 miles north of Baton Rouge proper on a bluff. And then, of course, the Confederates had set up at Vicksburg, a little further up the river. So the Union, despite holding the northern part of the Mississippi River, the mouth of the Mississippi River, couldn't get anything through. And so a really big push of the Union strategy was actually to take control of the Mississippi River because, one, they would hold control of the river so they could push supplies and stuff through, but then also would cut the Confederacy in half because even though we think of us in Louisiana, we know that this is a little bit different. Most people, when they think of the Confederacies, they're thinking of the Southeast, but Texas was super important. As we'll find out with the fall 1863 campaign, Nathaniel Banks and them were fascinated with taking Texas because they wanted the cotton fields, they wanted the money, and then they also wanted to protect the United States from Napoleon III in Mexico. And so Louisiana itself was a buffer because the Confederacy, they wanted to keep the Union forces away from there. One of the big things, of course, was the wealth. The Bayou Teche region was one of the wealthiest regions in the Confederacy because of the sugar trade. Lincoln called it the Mississippi River the backbone of the rebellion. So if they took the river, the Confederacy's rebellion would be in dire straits. So why an invasion of the Bayou Teche region? I grew up between Lafayette and New Iberia. I grew up by Cade off Duchamp Road and stuff like that. I thought that I lived in the most boring place on earth. And then I find out there's like all of this rich history here. Like we would go to the library every Monday, and I'm just driving by here and stuff, and I didn't realize that this is right where 10,000 Union troops marched through, and there were 4,000 Confederates running right behind them. But why an invasion of the Teche region? So whenever I started looking for this, I was thinking, okay, there's like these strategic regions and stuff. And I was reading economic history, and I thought it was really interesting was that I forgot that at the time, the Civil War was really in the balance. And President Lincoln had a real big issue with Democrats in the North, the Copperheads, that they were opposed to the Civil War because they had economic interests in the South. And so his alliance of keeping the Union together at this point, because this was before, of course, the fall of Vicksburg, it was before the fall of Gettysburg, like the Civil War was still in the balance. And so Northeastern textile mills needed cotton, Midwestern farmers and merchants, even though if you were in Ohio, it was more expensive to send your goods from Ohio to Pennsylvania by land than it would be to take it to the Mississippi River. So having the Mississippi River out of Union control at that time meant that these economic leaders were losing funds and stuff, and as a result, they were mounting opposition against Lincoln. And Lincoln knew that if he lost the election in 1864, that would have been it. Like if the Democrats would have taken control of the presidency, the Confederacy probably would have been cut loose. So Lincoln was looking for a win to placate these economic interests. Like I said, only 1% of normal cotton was shipped to the Union, and in addition, there was an economic reason for this, was that marching through the Teche region and north of the Teche region, you have all those cotton crops that the Union would actually seize cotton crops and send them back to the Union. So it wasn't just opening up this region for planting and bringing in things down the Mississippi River. It was actually going to be the seizure of goods and stuff for the Union. In addition, Port Hudson being a sticking point to it, the Bayou Teche region was a back door for Port Hudson, and that's what ends up happening is the Union knew that if they would march up the Teche region and go toward Opelousas, they could then head east and go around the Atchafalaya Swamp and get to Port Hudson that way, because the guns and gunboats on the Mississippi River were keeping them at bay for Port Hudson. And also, in addition, before this, the Civil War hadn't really touched the Teche region apart from soldiers being drafted or volunteering to go and fight. So the geography of itself, that we know this because we're from here, but the Bayou Teche region was really, really isolated. Dense forests, swamps. If you played in the backwoods as a kid, you know how dense it is. And so like when I was making the video, I was thinking about like the Union troops marching through like the woods in my backyard. It isn't just like going up 182, you know, like they were hacking their way through the woods here. There was only one maintained road between Franklin and Lafayette, which is essentially right here on Highway 182. Like this was the only maintained road in the region. Also, the Confederates had created, there was a natural choke point, actually where the Wax Lake outlet is now, we'll talk about that, at Fort Bisland. So the only way the Union could actually march through, they had a fortification right there, blocking the entrance to this. And why geography matters? Well, I have a minor in geography, so thinking about like the geography of the region, like what makes it so important and stuff is by having that, the Union forces could only go through one door. And because they could only go through one door, if you held onto that door as long as possible, even though you had like a greater force of soldiers, they still couldn't get through. Also, the local knowledge was crucial, as we'll find out the reason why the Confederates escaped, because they knew about a back road and the Union had no clue about it. And then also naval accessibility, because me growing up, I still like think about the Teche, that they have like these steamers and stuff, you know, like going up and down the bayou and turning around and stuff like that, as narrow as it is. If you read Shane Bernard's book, Teche, he talks about all the turnarounds and stuff. And so like, even as I was reading that and I was preparing for this, I kept on thinking about like the gunboats and stuff going down there, and also the Atchafalaya Swamp, because at the time, the Atchafalaya Swamp had way more open water than it does now. So it was far more navigable than it is today. So this is the region. So we're talking about New Orleans right here. The Union had already moved through and had taken this area. Right here is Brashear City. It's now known as Morgan City. And so Pattersonville was right here. Fort Bisland is just at this point. We have Franklin, the Indian village we now know as Sharonton, New Iberia, Cotegalie, which is Broussard, Vermilionville, up toward Opelousas. So this is the region we're talking about. Like this is where we're all from and stuff like that. So the military objectives. I think if we're going to talk about a military campaign, we need to understand what both sides are attempting to achieve. Because whenever we talk about who wins this, spoilers, the Union took the Teche region. But, you know, like sorry for spoiling it here. You know, even though they took the region, we need to think about why they were doing what they were doing whenever we actually talk about success. Because one of the things I learned when studying history is that things are way more complicated than how it looks on the surface. So the Union's primary military target was actually to destroy General Taylor's Confederate Army here. It was the only significant Confederate force remaining in Louisiana outside of Port Hudson. General Richard Taylor's Confederate forces, he had numbered about 4,000. Many of them were militiamen from this region. And so if the Union could take them in one fell swoop, then there would be no remaining military forces. The Union could then do whatever they wanted with Western Louisiana, because the Confederates would then be in a bind. Would they send troops away from Texas, or would they give up the rest of Louisiana? The economic goal was the capture enough cotton and sugar acreage to satisfy northern business interests. And also the larger goal was to support General Grant's campaigns in Vicksburg. So, and as we'll talk about this, General Nathaniel Banks and General U.S. Grant end up having a big argument over who was going to go where after this. And the political goal was to demonstrate progress to maintain support for the war. If they took the Teche region, if they got cotton, if they got sugar, and eventually get the Port Hudson Mississippi River, a lot of, as you end up seeing what happens in July of 1863, a lot of the opposition that the Union had for a lot of opposition in the Union against the war then vanishes, which means they have a united front to crush the rebellion once and for all. So the Confederate objectives, on the other side, the Confederates, what was their objective for this? Well, the primary goal for General Taylor was actually to preserve his army. In some ways, actually holding on to the land was completely That was completely useless. Like he was completely willing to give up the Teche region because he knew his force was too small. But if he kept his military forces together, he could always use them to fight another day. Hold on to that thought. The strategic control was, the goal was to prevent the Union control of western Louisiana, because they knew that the Confederates knew that if they gave up the Bayou Teche region, the more important stuff in the Red River and holding on to Texas was important, even though this would be a huge economic loss. The tactical goal at the smaller thing was, if they were going to have to give up this region, they were going to have to use local knowledge in a way to not get themselves captured or destroyed. And the economic goal was, as best as possible, to deny Union access to the region's wealth. Spoilers, they didn't do it at all. So our two commanders, number one, General Nathaniel Banks. He's probably, according to historians, the most stereotypical of Lincoln's political generals. He was actually the former Speaker of the House and Governor of Massachusetts. I can't imagine Governor Landry, there's a civil war. Well, I'm just going to be a general. Like, it just boggles my mind that they did that in the Civil War. And he is really maligned in history, and we'll talk about the historiography later on, is like how it's treated in history. And so, like, he wasn't a very good general, but there's some revision about it. What someone said is, one of the important things he did was, after New Orleans was captured, they had Benjamin Butler, the Beast. He gave like the order to like treat women as prostitutes if they, slandered Union soldiers. Butler got kicked out. Banks comes in and settles everything down. He used his political skills for this. And maybe he was a terrible general, but that doesn't mean he was an incompetent person. And I think that gets lost in looking at the battles and campaigns. And even whenever I did the video and did the research, like, I was focused only on the military part, but widening it out to there is that he was a very good administrator. And in fact, 19 Corps, the military unit he was in charge of, was actually very well administrated. He had that ability. He was just the right guy in the wrong position for this. His forces here was about 15,000 troops from New England and New York. And like I said, he replaced Benjamin Butler in New Orleans. Facing off against him was General Richard Taylor. He was the son of former President Zachary Taylor. Richard Taylor is a man after my own heart. He was brought onto General Bragg's staff to train Confederate soldiers at the start of rebellion because he was a military history buff. The story is so funny because he tried to join the military. He had problems with asthma and other health, and so he resigns his commission. He was initially, like actually a lot of Confederate generals, on the fence about seceding, but then once the die was cast, he sides with the Confederacy. General Braxton Bragg calls him over and like, well, military history, and you know how the military works because your father, can you help train troops? And he ends up getting commissioned as a general. And in July of 1862, he was put in command of all Confederate troops south of the Red River in Louisiana. So this was a part of his command. Like I said, he only had about 4,000 men under his command. So it wasn't a large force, but it was strategically significant because this is all the Confederacy had. So I wanted to go over this because I didn't know the military knowledge of the crowd, because we're going to talk about some different units. But we talk about a company, a regiment. A regiment is, in the Civil War, most of the time what people said they were a part of. Oh, well, I'm a part of the 15th, or I'm the part of the 4th Louisiana Volunteers. That was a regiment of about 1,000 men. In the Confederacy, that would only be about 400 men because they were extremely understaffed. You have 3 to 6 regiments, which make a brigade. 2 to 4 brigades make a division. A division was your primary maneuver unit in the military. So you would put your brigades together, and they would all move together. And then you would put your divisions together into an overall organization called the Corps. The Union had, under General Banks' command, was 19 Corps. 19 Corps, he had his 2 to 4 divisions, and with him you had your brigades and stuff like that. So combat tactics, if you don't know anything about the Civil War, is that in our popular conception, they all just lined up and they just shot at each other. That's not quite how it worked. You usually had 2 to 3 men deep, soldiers. I was about to say students. No, like teacher getting out. They stood shoulder to shoulder because massed fire was the way that you used arms for decision. In other words, that's how you won your battle, is that because the rate of fire was so slow, mass volley fire was the way that you did it. They would advance, halt at about 1 to 200 yards, fire volleys, they would fix bayonets, and then they would charge in. The problem was technology had changed by this time, that you started having rifled barrels, which is the twist in the barrel. So mass fire, suddenly the lethality moved out to several hundred yards. So that's where we start getting that motion toward more what we consider modern firearms. So the killing zone, it used to be very up close and personal. The Civil War, you see that. In fact, if you look at the Civil War in Louisiana over there, they had like the mini balls and the start of the rifle rounds with it. But in front of the line, you had skirmishers. They were light infantry. They did more of what we would consider to be, soldiering. Like they would run around, they would hide in the trees and in the brush, and they were considered your reconnaissance, because the key thing about the military, the way you get victory is you use reconnaissance to find the enemy, you pin them down, you bring fire on them, and you decide the battle right there. So the skirmishers were really, really important in the Civil War, because that was the only way you could find, that was the only way that you could actually find the enemy. So this is generally what you would see. This was actually in Virginia, obviously not Louisiana, because there are hills in this image, but you would have masses of soldiers that once they got close enough, fixed bayonets, go in there. In terms of supporting arms, you have your artillery. The most common was the Napoleonic 12-pounder, so they shot a 12-pound shell. Effective range was 1,000 to 1,500 yards. They would use solid shells, solid rounds, but then they would use what are called canister shells, which would have it would be essentially a shotgun shell that they would use at close range. Cavalry, the popular image was charging in with sabers. As you know, cavalry charges never really worked in the Civil War, apart from the giant raid in Mississippi in 1863. And the reason was terrain and also infantry firepower. It was getting to the point where they could keep the horses at bay because they could offer fire against them. And also naval fire support, especially here in Louisiana. So as soon as war broke out, they stuck cannons and guns on every single steamboat that they could. And my favorite thing is they armored them with boilerplate metal and cotton. They would use bales of cotton. In fact, they were a class of warships that they called cottonclads. So whenever we talk about cavalry, this was very, very rare. Usually you would have your cavalry. In fact, a lot of cavalrymen end up becoming what are called mounted infantry, where they would get off of their horse and fight as infantry, whereas cavalry just sits on their horse and rides all the time. Like their horse is their main weapon. So, and this right here is a Union artillery battery, which they have, as you'll see, we had like an extended artillery duel and a couple of things. And see, here's a Union steamer. This steamboat right here has sheet metal and other boilerplate on it use it for protection. It was useful against rifle fire, and things, but it was not useful against cannons or anything like that. So it's not like modern warship armor or anything like that. So we get the campaign kicked off in April. So in Morgan City, 15,000 soldiers show up, which I think Brashear City at the time only had 1,500 people. So like the population explodes by 1,000%. The Brashear City was important because it was put in its place for two reasons. One, it was at the mouth of the Atchafalaya River, and two, it was the endpoint for the railroad that connected to New Orleans. So the Union forces already controlled the east side of the Atchafalaya River, and Banks brings his soldiers here. On April 9th, 2 divisions crossed to march along Bayou Teche under the command of General Emory, and then 3 days later, a 3rd division boards steamboats, and they go up into Grand Lake under General Grover. And the strategy was General Emory's forces would march along Bayou Teche, and General Grover would go around the Confederates north of Franklin, cut them off, easy peasy, no problem at all. This was our plan, was that Emory was going to move here, Grover was going to go through Grand Lake and come somewhere north of Franklin, because they figured that would be the best place to get them, because at the time Franklin was actually a very, very important city in the Teche region because you had so many wealthy planters there. So the first of 3 major engagements was at Fort Bislow on April 12th and 13th. This was the main defense. Remember I said that this was the choke point, and we'll look at this in a second. So General Taylor was like, this is where we're going to put our men at. And this is where we're going to set up here. 2,200 men, 18 field guns, and a steamboat along Bayou Teche by the name of Diana. So she had cannon as well. And so it was going to be used as mobile firepower that could just sail up and down the bayou, shooting into the flanks of the Union. What was really important about Fort Bisland is it had earthworks on both sides of the bayou, and they butted up against the woods. So there was no way for this several thousand strong Union force to go except right here. So if we look at it, it's right along where Highway 90 is. In fact, it's right at Wax Lake Outlet. It's not there anymore because they ruined it because they were digging out Wax Lake Outlet, but the memorial is right there. But it's essentially along this region. This was marshland, and then you had sugarcane fields, and the defenses were on both sides of it. So there was no way Union soldiers coming this way or even coming around the lake right here, there was no way for the Union forces to actually pass through. The Union, this was one of the quotes I remembered, is that the fields through which we marched were covered with a growth of sugarcane so high that the lines were almost concealed, so dense it required the most fatiguing labor for the men to push their way through. One of the things to remember is these people are from New England. 70 degrees is hot for them. Like, you know, so this is like the beginning of April. Like, we know, like, it's starting to get warm and stuff. And these were all freshly volunteered soldiers. So this was their first taste of combat. Like, there were like cheers of hurrahs and all this stuff. And they're marching up there. And it's funny, is the initial advance actually takes a day longer because they all got tired at the end of the day. And General Banks and General Emery decides, you know what, we've had a hard day marching 5 miles. Let's take a nap. Let's sleep for the night, and then we're going to attack the next day. So opening shots, Union artillery deploys under fire. They engage to prepared positions. The good part about a fort like that is you can fire as much as you can. Unless you get arcing fire over, you're not going to really do anything to it. Both sides receive light casualties because the Confederates have their own guns, so the Union artillery cannot get close enough to do anything of substance. CSS Diana moves downstream. Everything's looking great for the Confederates, but then a lucky shot pierces her armor and disables her boiler. So she's knocked out. And so she moved, they put her along the bank. Union forces can't get to her, but Taylor's main source of mobile firepower is now in trouble. And so his plan starts unraveling. Fighting stops at sundown. Both sides sleep in their positions. One of the things during the open shots, General Taylor is very famous for this because his soldiers, again, militiamen, no real experience of combat, they're scared. Well, while all these artillery shells are flying over, he lights a cigarette and walks across the ramparts of the defenses, telling them, come on, boys, like, I'm not going to get shot. Y'all come on and fight too. And this was like his defining moment. He talks about it in his memoirs, and it gets brought up in other sources that that rallied the soldiers, that they saw that their general was not afraid of getting shot, that they would continue to fight. So you would have skirmishers fighting in this region. The Union tried to turn the lines with skirmishers, but this was inconclusive with this. So General Taylor, the next day, overnight, he had a problem. His problem was he found out that General Grover was sailing in Grand Lake and was going to cut him off. He had ordered General Sibley, one of his cavalry commanders, to launch a surprise attack on the 12th against General Grover. Sibley decides to not do it. So now he's really in a bind because he has this force of one whole division that's going to embark right behind him. He's got two divisions of Union right in front of him. He loses his force. This is it for Louisiana. If Banks would have offered a full assault on the 12th, he could have actually taken the earthworks and done it there. Would have had a lot of losses, but he could have taken it. But Banks decided not to because his soldiers were tired. So what ends up happening is Taylor decides to withdraw while everyone's sleeping. Almost all the Confederate forces leave overnight, abandoning Fort Bisland. Union forces take it the next day, and rather than chase Taylor, he decides to let the soldiers celebrate their first major victory against the Confederacy. And this quote just like cracks me up. So at around 11:30, Colonel Kimball, the 53rd Massachusetts, heard the enemy making preparations for evacuating their entrenchments. The movement of artillery and baggage wagons, packing and nailing of boxes, drivers cursing their mules could be distinctly heard by the advanced pickets of Colonel Gooding's brigade. They tried to get General Banks to wake up that we should do something, They couldn't wake him up. Like, this is just like, you know, like, I just, as a military, as someone says military history, I just like, got to be decisive. And that's one of the things you see with General Banks in this whole thing. The Union could have finished this in one day, but they weren't decisive, and it cost them in the end. And ironically, it bites them in the rear end over a year later with the Red River Campaign. So let's talk about the flanking maneuver. General Grover's original target was Miller's Point near Oak Lawn Plantation, if you've been down Irish Bend Road. So what he wanted to do was he wanted to embark his soldiers. He wanted to disembark them off the boats, take Oak Lawn Plantation, and the road at the time, of course, was Irish Bend Road, not where 182 is now. So what he wanted to do was march down to Franklin, because that was the only way that they would cut off the Confederate retreat. There were issues from the start. One of his gunboats runs aground. It was unable to be floated free, so Grover's like, we're just gonna have to leave him alone, which deprives them of some firepower. Once they get to Miller's Point, there was no reconnaissance, and because this is April, your Mississippi is high water, which you have some of the water coming down the Atchafalaya is at high water, and the Oyster Shell Road was flooded. They couldn't get any men or guns down there. So it was flooded and impassable. So as a result, they sail further up at Mayette Point, which, if you know the Mayette Point boat landing in between Franklin and Baldwin, that's where they end up landing at. But the problem is at Mayette Point, the water's deeper than at Oak Lawn. So artillery, they ended up having to build a bridge to get their guns across, which wasted more time with this. So this leads to the second engagement known as the Battle of Irish Bend. The trap stalls. So by this time, the Confederates saw all of this going on, and the 2nd Louisiana Cavalry actually ambushes the landing party as they're arriving there. But it's just sporadic fire because it was maybe 100 troops at the most. You know, skirmishers, Union immediately deploys skirmishers. They shoot at each other for 10, 15 minutes. Cavalry runs off. So it doesn't do much for the landing. But the important thing is now they know actually where Grover's at. The cavalry attempts to burn down the 2 crossings of the bayou, but the bridges were captured before they were burned down. They managed to put the fire out, because if the bridges would have been burned, they couldn't have crossed Bayou Teche, and Taylor would have really been able to escape. So there were more delays for the Union. It took the entire day to land their forces. So even like the soldiers had trouble marching through chest-deep water. They get them all out. Soldiers are hungry. They have to eat and stuff like that. And it took them 3 hours to march 5 miles from Mayette Point to Oak Lawn Plantation, which that sounds like a really long time. It is. But if you're deploying couple thousand soldiers to get them in order and march them there, it does take some time, but more time than it was necessary. What Grover could have done is he did have skirmishers and he had some advanced elements, and he should have sent them up the road to see where the Confederates were at, or even take the bridges or find where the Confederate forces at, but he decided not to because he vastly overestimated his opponent. So on one hand, you have Banks just thinking that this is going to be a stroll in the park. On the other hand, Grover is terrified, as we'll see with some of the things that he says. He's just terrified that there's this huge Confederate force that's going to attack him, when really there was nobody there for him. So his planned advance was actually here at Oak Lawn, but his actual advance was right here, further down the road. So, and Franklin is down here. So this is Irish Bend Road, where it still is now. This is kind of where US 182 is. Think about this side road. And this is going to be the area where the Battle of Irish Bend takes place, which, just as a local thing, I had lunch with former Governor Foster at Oak Lawn before, and we were talking about this, and that was one of the first seeds in my mind about this. Is like, holy cow, like, wait, they're like, he's like, yeah, they showed up and they camped on the grounds, and then, like, you know, they had to cook them food and stuff like that. I'm like, wait, there were like how many? So it was just one of these things like, wait, I've passed down this place, like, this is where military history and actual, you know, things of the Civil War happened right here. So this is from Grover. This is his quote about this. He says, soon after, reports from the front led me to believe that the enemy was in stronger force than had been at first anticipated. It was not my intention to expose a large force to the view of the enemy until the whole division was ready. So what Grover is saying is he did not want to force battle until all of his soldiers were there, because he vastly overestimated what was facing him. And that overestimation bites him in the rear end. So the Battle of Irish Bend actually takes place here on April the 14th. Taylor's strategy is, again, Taylor uses terrain. That military history buff thing is, if you control where the battle's going to be, you can dictate the pace of operations. So they set up at dawn in a wooded area between Bayou Yokley and Bayou Teche. So there was no place for the Union to get around them. And if you've watched my videos, I'm standing in the cane field, like essentially where the battle took place. The bulk of Taylor's forces, so he actually does not deploy most of his force. Most of them had already evacuated from Fort Bisland to Franklin, and he decides to send them up that side road that the Union had no clue that was there. Instead, he just put a screen of soldiers that would just delay Grover as long as possible. And so as soon as they knew that the Confederates had escaped, they would just retreat behind them. Taylor had to be set in place before dawn to cover the retreat because that's when they would be passing by. So he had to get his forces in place just in case Grover woke up before him. He did not. So this is how the battle actually sets up. The blocking force is right here. So actually modern day Franklin, this is where the golf course is. And so it's down here and the Sterling Mill is around here. So the battle goes right here. If you look at it in Google Maps, there's actually still the woods of the bayou. It's still right there. So all of this stuff is actually modern day cane fields. At the time, however, there was forest right there. So they deploy themselves anchored between the forest and the bayou. So there's no way for Grover to advance without meeting them. So, and that's the idea, is that the Confederates would escape from there. So the battle unfolds. Union skirmishers are surprised by Confederate fire. Skirmishers go down the road. All of a sudden, they're getting shot at. They're like, we didn't think the Confederates would be there. So Grover deploys his forces. They start moving down the road. The 159th New York Regiment is caught in the open. The Confederates let loose the rebel yell, and Louisiana militia charges them and throws them into complete panic, because it's important to remember these Union forces have never been in battle either. General Dwight decides to launch a counterattack with 4 regiments. And these 4 regiments are essentially more than Taylor's force right here. So the Confederacy falls back. The retreat, about 70 men are captured in chaos. If you're like, well, how is all this going on? I got some animations I'll show you in a second. There's a surprise arrival. The CSS Diana returns and starts shooting up a storm as it's sailing up the bayou. And this changed Grover's entire battle. In fact, Diana showing back up essentially saved Taylor there, because Grover was planning a charge to take and push through, because the battle was starting to go into the way of the Union. Diana shows up and he essentially stops his advance and then essentially retreats back to expect a counterattack. He's like, wait, I have guns on my side. I have no gunboats. I have no gunboats on the bayou that can support me. All of a sudden, I don't know what's about to happen. Because again, if you remember, he vastly overestimated how many Confederate troops he was facing. So this is actually from, I think it's, I forget the name of the newspaper. Harper's Weekly. This is the Battle of Irish Bend by one of the reporters. So even if you look on Wikipedia about the article, it's this picture right here from this. So the battle, what happens right here is Grover moves down to meet them in the morning. And then the Confederate charge, you have to move up, and Grover starts backing off. And then you have your Union counterattack, which starts moving in. Again, the battle is in the balance. And then CSS Diana shows up. And all of this happens before 9 in the morning. So this battle only took place for about 2 hours. So all of this occurs over the course of these 2 hours. And the Union counterattack stalls, like I said, once Diana shows up, they start falling back to where they have more room to maneuver, and they get a little more inland so the guns of Diana can't catch them in the crossfire. So while the battle raged, like I said, the bulk of Taylor's forces were in Franklin, ready to escape north. During the battle, General Alfred Mouton from Lafayette, his entire column passes behind on a side road. As whenever I'm reading the account of it, it still cracks me up. They're fighting in Franklin, and his whole column just runs right past them. I said that just the comedy of that is just the plan works, and Taylor manages to get his escape. Grover's failures, he never scouted the area. He did not know it existed. In fact, had he gone, when he gets up to Oak Lawn, he could have just turned the other way and came toward New Iberia. He would have found the roads. And he could have, like, any little bit of reconnaissance could have just closed this off. And then the comedic timing was as the final Confederate units are hightailing it out of Franklin, Banks's whole army marches into Franklin with the band and everything as though they're like conquerors. So like he's like, we've done it, as like his soldiers, as the Confederates run off. So the question becomes, who won? Who won about this battle? The facts on the ground is considered a Union victory because the Confederates fled the field of battle. It's kind of hard to claim that you won a battle if you run away. There were 353 casualties for Union forces. Only about 20 were wounded and killed for the Confederates. The wider picture, the entire purpose of Banks's advance was to capture this Confederate force. He does not do that. Taylor's forces didn't just escape. He got his entire force out of the way. So, the Union wins the battle, but Taylor lives to fight another day. And that's an important point to remember about this. So why didn't the trap close? The blame game. They all start blaming each other in official reports. The official history was that they blamed General Banks for sending Grover with too many forces, and he was following orders. Grover explained that it was not conducive for cutting off the Confederate retreat. I mean, had you done some reconnaissance, it would have helped. And also the appearance of Diana made him fearful of crossfire. John D. Winters, who wrote kind of, for our purposes, the definitive account of the Civil War in Louisiana, that's the name of the book, says that the painful truth didn't dawn. Grover realized that he, with over 5,000 troops and a vastly superior artillery, had been held at bay by barely 1,000 men while Taylor's main force escaped. Like, it's just militarily, I can't believe this. And the official history of 19 Corps says this, that Grover chose to obey the clearly expressed orders rather than follow the illusory inspirations of the will-o'-the-wisp commonly mistaken for genius, which I think is really funny. I think in concept, modern day, especially United States and NATO in the West, we consider military, you have looser orders that the commander on the ground is the person who's best judged, so orders aren't as strict. Grover relied on doing the orders, but had he been a seasoned commander, he would have sent more reconnaissance in order to figure out the area. So instead, he just blamed, well, I was just following orders. Like, sorry, guys. And then, like, this, in his report, he talks about how that once the forces was massed, Taylor, the gunboat Diana, commenced moving up slowly. I prepared to receive to make the attack. In other words, he essentially admits in his official report on the Battle of Irish Bend that the second Diana showed up, like, he decided to not attack. So from here on out, it just becomes a race. Can Taylor get away from the Union? Can he get away from them? Small units skirmish and withdraw. So what they'll do is they would come up Highway 182, essentially where 182 is. Taylor would leave a couple hundred men as skirmishers. Union skirmishers would find them. They would shoot at each other. It would, the Union forces would set out on a battle line, and the skirmishers would withdraw. They slowed their advance to let the main column pass through New Iberia. Like, this is all about can we get enough space and time. An unfinished gunboat was on Bayou Teche. It was the Stevens. General Taylor orders it put sideways and sunk in the bayou in order, just in case that the Union had any gunboats, it would block their advance. So, and also at this time, as we'll talk about, like, morale with the Confederates is really, really low because the fact that they're retreating and they can't beat this force. There was a raid at Avery Island on April the 17th. This was one of the main sources of salt for the Confederacy. They had already attacked in 1862. A Union detachment was sent. They find the mine. They destroy it. Ironically enough, when they come back in the fall of 1863, the Union realizes they need salt and they have to rebuild the mine. Then begins the long chase to Vermilionville. At Camp Pratt at Spanish Lake, they rest. You start having lots and lots and lots and lots of desertions. The entire 12th Louisiana Battalion deserts. One of the Texas contingents makes a break for Texas because they're like, we need to go protect our own homeland from there. Union has discipline problems. Unauthorized riders, you see infantrymen start commandeering horses and riding them. The 114th New York had to man a checkpoint to arrest unauthorized riders. So you had, like, enlisted men riding horses because only officers can do that. The Union soldiers talk about this, how, it's just like this massive humanity marching up this road. It was hot. They were thirsty. They were hungry. Timelessness for the military. And the same thing, 16th Louisiana Infantry also says this, because it was a breakneck pace to try and escape the Union trap. There was a skirmish at Bayou Vermilion. Why there? Because there were steep banks at Bayou Vermilion. It was not an easy crossing. The purpose was to screen the Confederate retreat. They deploy guns. Union pursuit force begins an artillery duel. They shoot at each other. One Confederate's wounded, one Union dead, 5 wounded. All it does is continue to buy time for the Confederacy. Vermilionville is occupied. Again, the full Union force enters. White flags all over the town. They arrest Alexander Mouton, General Mouton's father, because he presided over the secession convention, and he was under house arrest in New Orleans for there. The end of the pursuit was in Opelousas. The state government had already fled for Shreveport, because the further they could get away from Union, the better. Banks could have captured him, but decided just to take his merry way up there. He only arrived in Opelousas 3 days after Taylor was gone. The town capitulates immediately. Taylor puts cavalry under General Mouton's command to move west into the prairie, so around Eunice, Crowley, all this area, to go around and raid supply lines. The Atchafalaya Basin, the gunboats move up. They capture Fort Burton by Butte La Rose. 4 companies of New Hampshire infantry take it. It was the last Confederate outpost in the Atchafalaya River with minimal resistance, and the New Hampshire infantry had to stay there for the summer. They were wondering how they got, I think they were wondering how they got punished in their wool uniforms from soldiers in New Hampshire sweating it out in the Louisiana summer. So like this was their summer for this. The campaign concludes. Banks camped in Opelousas, tried to capture Alexandria. He was disappointed to find out that Grant had already captured him. Him and Grant start arguing over what to do next. Grant asks Banks to come up and meet him to help take Vicksburg. Banks wants to capture Port Hudson because it's going to look really good on his resume and it's going to look really good at home. They bicker and argue with each other. He delays the request, and then he figures out what he's going to do. He declines Grant's request. On May 15th, he moves there. A smaller force heads down Bayou Teche to cover their rear lines. And so again, they marched across through Simmsport and all of these areas. So let's talk about the civilians, since we don't have much time with this. I also want to talk about the slavery with here. Rural Teche region, Franklin and New Iberia were the only towns of note. Large sugar plantations. Those who could flee fled. Foreign flags appeared on houses because they figured that some of them were foreign born. Others would put foreign flags, well, maybe they will leave us alone. They offered the oath of allegiance. Of course, you know, here at Shadows-on-the-Teche, she refused the oath of allegiance because she couldn't, she's like, I can't do that. Of course, General Taylor talks about the Cajuns, that, you know, this region was completely isolated from the rest of Louisiana, you know, because of the Atchafalaya, and that he really enjoyed like the Cajun soldiers and stuff, but they were just a completely different group of people from there. Union view of the Teche region. Several diary entries mentioned that the Teche looked like, quote, the Garden of Eden before Adam's fall. I mean, I guess if you lived in Boston, any sort of green would look good. Foraging and looting was a real thing. Roads were littered with books, furniture, chinaware, ladies' apparel, farming utensils. Over 500 men were involved with looting. At least one private from the 131st New York Infantry was shot for taking clothing. Episcopal Church of the Epiphany here was used as a barracks and also as a medical station, and the pews were used as feed troughs in the for the cavalry here, which I rode right there. My mom, when it was icy in 1988, we rear-ended somebody coming home from church right in front of that church. I was like, golly, my dad's here. You remember that? Dad, we got in a wreck. Like, I can't believe that place, that was history right there. I never would, until I researched that much history was right there. So also, if you notice, the enslaved people. Lawlessness, you have outlaws and contrabands of free enslaved people, raided communities. Over $105 million was confiscated from the region. Previously, foreign farmers and plantation owners alike were let penniless. So you had all of these millionaires, all of their stuff was taken from them. Now, if we want to talk about the enslaved people, at every plantation, the road would be lined and the fences covered with grinning faces, men, women, and children, curtsying and bowing, singing and dancing. I'm so glad to see you all. Like, the day of redemption was at hand for the enslaved people of the region. But this gets a little bit complicated because the Emancipation Proclamation exempted St. Mary and St. Martin parishes. Here in Iberia, slaves were under the Emancipation Proclamation, which meant they were freed when the Union showed up. Legally speaking, St. Mary and St. Martin parishes were not. Having said that, though, if you have all of these Union soldiers there, if you're an enslaved person and you've spent all of your life in chains, the first thing you're going to do is you're gone. So over 5,000 led, regardless of legal status. Freed enslaved men became the nucleus of the 2nd and 3rd Louisiana Native Guards, the first all-black Union military units. So the nucleus of these military units raised by General Banks actually came from here, from freed enslaved African Americans. In addition, they were used as laborers in order to take all the cotton and sugarcane down. Now, there's turmoil and violence of all this. Anytime you have military conflict, it kind of devolves into this. The irony of the Union invasion was that the freed blacks were needed to continue the economic exploitation. That's one of the ironies of this. Banks attempted to return people to plantation for wages. Did not have any success apart from here in Iberia Parish, in fact. This was around New Iberia was the only area where they were able to convince emancipated blacks to come back and work on the farms, and they would pay them for it. Unrest in rear lines led General Banks to station extra troops. There was widespread violence. Homes across the region were looted by contrabands. The worst was an attack on St. Martinville by former slaves. It fortunately led to lynchings and hangings by people who were not involved in the attack with that. So you still had this issue of all of this going on right here. So who won? It depends on what you see as victory. If you're the Union, they controlled the Teche and the Atchafalaya. They confiscated goods and cotton. They satisfied the northern business interests. The strategic objective actually leaves to Banks taking Port Hudson and the rest of the opening up the Mississippi. Banks told his wife in a letter that it was the cleanest, best conceived, and best executed campaign of the war, which if you know about his campaigns in Virginia, they were all unmitigated disasters. So the fact that he didn't have a disaster was good enough for him. The case for the Confederacy was conserving combat power. So in some ways, Taylor got what he wanted. He was able to escape with his forces intact. Union control was temporary. In fact, as the Port Hudson siege was ending, Taylor marches right back through in a counterattack and takes them, and they rout the Union force at Brashear City. In fact, they march all the way to Kenner and New Orleans, and they decide to turn back. The Confederates actually never lost to the Union. In all of these engagements, the Confederates decided when to end the engagement too. So that comes to who wins and loses. In the grand scheme of things, this operation was a success for the Union, but in military terms for the Confederacy, this was also successful for them. They got what they wanted out of this. So the historiography, where did I learn all of this? You have sources from unit histories. General Taylor's memoirs are a really, really good read, the official military accounts. There's the Civil War in Louisiana. Morris Raphael, the local, he wrote several books. He emphasizes local research. He always claims to be unbiased, but I love his ending. It's always like, I tried to be unbiased, but I want to end this on the happy note where the locals win. And I was like, okay, Mr. Raphael, we see where you're going from. The most recent book, Shane K. Bernard's Teche, he briefly talks about this military campaign. Donald Frazier, in fact, I'll give a plug for the books. Thunder Across the Swamp is they're really, really good. He claims this to be the Bayou Teche campaign to be a massive success for the Union. He talks about Banks's brilliance, and I'm like, I know you have a PhD in military history, but he could have ended this in an afternoon, and he really didn't. So like me as a, I guess I can call myself a historian, like that's one of the things that the more modern accounts are coming around to being more positive about, being more positive to the view of General Banks. Whereas I still see this campaign was like, he got what he wanted, but that was only because the Confederate force was too small to challenge him. And so I almost wonder, if Taylor had more forces, would it have been as easy of a walk from there? But there's some historical lessons from this. Military lessons is geography trumps numbers. Like Taylor used his geography at every single term and stymied the Union advance. The economic causes of warfare are just as important as the military parts, which, they would have never invaded the Bayou Teche region if Democratic forces in the Midwest weren't clamoring for the Mississippi River to be open and confiscating goods. The Teche campaign set off nearly 2 years of violence and destruction in the region, which led even into well past Reconstruction that the Teche region didn't recover. Modern relevance, the Civil War still, I told my social studies students whenever I taught the Civil War, is that and I say in the video that civil wars are really, really personal. And even for me, my family, they're all from Roberts Cove. So they're all Germans. Like they all came to the US in 1905. So for me, coming into this is like, well, like I don't have any, I can be unbiased. But even as I'm like reading and doing the research of it, I'm kind of secretly cheering for Taylor because he's like the underdog, and like these carpetbaggers are like marching through like where they marched along my library where I checked out all my books from the library. So like I realized I still have that local bias of this, of seeing this as like, even in this, as saying this is like, you know, like a Confederate. Yeah, they lost it, but you also need to look at it from the perspective that Taylor kind of got what he wanted. And so like I kind of want to make sure I mention that. It's like that implied bias from there. The debates over the federal government, cultural legacy, LSU Tigers, of course, are named after Louisiana infantry, the Tigers. That college football rivalries, like the whole thing, if the modern landscape of college football, I just know about this because I read a discussion about it, of like things about the Big Ten and SEC. The Civil War still rages on. It's like Southern solidarity goes on the football field, and like, you know, the Union see, like, you know, Northern states see this and they make those, and I'm like, and it's like, it's true. These lines are still there 160 years later. And this campaign, which there was one, of course, they came up in September and October, 1863. They came back with even more soldiers to occupy this, and then they left in 1864, and it continues into the Red River campaign. So he showed me the 5 minutes, and I think I'm done. So now is the scariest part that I have. Does anyone have any questions? Because I am not a Civil War expert. Yes.
Of course, I'm interested in the impact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have encountered 7 of my ancestral grandfathers who served in the Green Army.
Mm-hmm.
One in the Navy as an 11 and 12-year-old boy. He was a cavalry.
Mm-hmm.
Got his pension until 1939. So I take a lot of my information, from the experiences of the testimonies or depositions that they had to give to confirm who they were, that they were indeed, for example, Jean Louis, who went into the war, and his recruiters called him John Broussard,
Mm-hmm.
or Alphonse Manuel, whose recruiters called him Alfonso Violent. So they had to have proof as to who they were. So my interest has always been on the voices of the Africans who were enslaved, and even those who weren't enslaved, and the impact this war had on all the people in my community, you know. And Brashear City is a critical location for me in the studies that I have been doing. When the feds left Iberia, that was 10,000 people, whatever, it included my family members. When they got to Brashear City, there was supposed to be a contraband camp, which I have seen referred to time and time again. But I have not been able to locate, except one of my friends, Roland Stansbury, may he rest in peace. He brought me out to Morgan City, where he thinks the contraband camp was, which was at Bayou Buff,
Mm-hmm.
because they were facing off with the Confederates at Hoopa across the river. Yeah, what is it, Burry?
Mhm.
Is it Burry?
Yes.
Burry. So and Dan Frazier and I, we talked too, or Don Frazier. And I think the camp would have been along Bayou Ramos, behind the Union troops. So I guess what I would like to know from you in your research, have you found any more reference to that contraband camp?
No. I will say this is like, for just like, in terms of like, I don't have access to all the academic research and stuff. And honestly, for me, the focus was Irish Ben and stuff like that. I will say, like, looking online is like, there's not even a lot about this campaign. In fact, I would say there's only 5 or 6 sources. And Frazier's book is whatever information he gave you was the most up to date and most comprehensive, because like when you search about it, there's just nothing. And even whenever you go digging into the accounts of like the Union regiments and stuff and trying to piece where they were, like even if you try to like corroborate it and stuff, you don't, like, it doesn't line up. And I think part of it is just like the problem of historical research, especially if you think about like these Union soldiers, like they don't even know the language, because like over here so many, like they all spoke French, and they're trying to name something and trying to triangulate that with what we call it in the modern day versus what was called then. It's coming up for it. But I do know that, like you said, Brashear City was like a key hub for the Union keeping it, because it wasn't just contraband, former enslaved Africans, but it was also the workers that Banks used for taking all of the sugar and all of the cotton for there. That ended up being a huge congregation of emancipated enslaved people was actually right there. Yeah, only what's online, like the cop. Yeah, and I think official histories are always funny, because like what I think is interesting about the Civil War is that the official history of both the Union and Confederacy was done by the American government after the war. And so just like thinking about how we use the narrative of what happened gets to be really interesting. Is like, boy, in this case, really do victors write the history? Because like they brought sources from the Confederacy and stuff for that. I'm just like historical perspective. Yeah, it's interesting that this primary document, just for historical purposes, is funny that it was written through that perspective with that. I find that interesting. Is usually you have a losing side. Like for instance, World War I is like my current super interest. And so you hear there's writings by the Austrians, even though the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like they wrote their own history afterward. You know, they wrote the history of them losing. And so it's just funny to think of the official history, like you mentioned, that the Confederate official history was actually written by the Union afterward. I just think like the historian in me just kind of laughs at the irony of that. So, yes.
About the exemptions again?
For
St. Martin?
yes, so the Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah, it was into after the war. Yeah, and one of yes, yeah, and that was one of the things. Like, oh yeah, I remember. Yeah, wait, that was one of the things that dawned on me was reading about that. It says, yeah, emancipating slaves, like that's great. And it's like, oh, but wait, it's the emancipation. Wait, that didn't cover that. Oh, yeah. And so that led to, and that was one of the things. And also Banks was like, because Banks was an extreme abolitionist. He was super like they came in, you know, like the plantations get emptied out, and then all of a sudden they realize, oh, well, what are we supposed to do with this? And you know, like there was no plan for it, which ironically, since he was a pretty good administrator, he never thought about that. So yeah, like I thought that was it. I thought that was interesting, and how it all spirals out and continues over the years from there, even when the Union occupied.
Really clarifying that the Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people in areas under rebellion.
Yes.
So as the Union Army arrived, those areas were no longer under rebellion.
Hell yeah.
In St. Mary Parish, the Union kept the blacks as workers to actually harvest the sugar cane, to send that sugar and that cotton.
Yeah, and that's where Banks tried to, he offered up that scheme, and it only had limited success. And I will say, again, white guy, like if I was enslaved and I was under a master's whip and like treated inhumanely, the last thing I would want to do is go back into the field and do backbreaking work. I would be gone. And so that was the problem Banks ended up having. And by the way, this is like a wider military history thing. Is problem with an occupier is, what do you do with the population, especially in this circumstance? It's like there was an economic reality that one of his charges was to strip this area clean of wealth, and one of it was sugar, and suddenly had all of these freed people who were the backbone of labor, and he didn't have a workforce anymore. And so he came up with the idea of paying them, but a lot of them didn't, and eventually more of them got in, you know, and from there. Later on, yeah. Mm-hmm.
This, he's fighting the Confederates. The J.B. Cotton, under Captain Fuller, was fighting the Diana, the Stella, and two other ships. And the Confederates were much better, Navy, had a much better Navy. She actually had, the J.B. Cotton actually had oxen tied to the back of the boat. She would steam up forward, get a shot, the oxen would pull her back so they could not hit.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. Like they had set it up to where the speeder back going in reverse, that they had her, because the Teche is so narrow that they could actually just pull it back with that. So
I think we have time for one more question, maybe two. Okay, that's fine.
No, I just want to make a point. In 1862, and 63, I think, Confiscation Act, that gave, even though people who were enslaved lived in areas that were exempt, like my people,
mhm,
they could self-emancipate.
yeah.
They could walk. And the Congress had made it so that the feds had to, if my ancestors walked to their camp, they
Had to take them in.
And that's why they had those contrabands.
And that's also why Banks's order to raise the Native Guard was his way of getting more of them to come and self-emancipate with that.
200,000, I think it is, black men who served, helped to win that war. My people went to Port Hudson and Ship Island. The ones who went to Ship Island fought Confederate prisoners, you know. So it was important to have as many people as possible. Thank you.
Why did Banks not use reconnaissance or scouts or whatever? Is that just his?
He was not, he was a political general, so he did not have the military training. And what I just think is interesting is that his men under his command did not have a lot of military training, like what we would consider modern day military training. Like again, a lot of these regiments were volunteers. So like they would, a wealthy businessman, I'm raising a regiment of infantry to go fight against the Confederates. Who's with me? So you had a lot of these men who were in charge and stuff like that. And they just didn't have the military training, and they didn't think to use that, which is like a wider thing about the Civil War, is that the Union had to, well, all victorious armies end up having to learn how to fight the war that they're fighting. And that's one of the things we see with a lot of less effective generals that the Union have at the beginning of the war. The ones that survive staying in command, they learn their lessons and do that. And one of the funny ironies is that General Nathaniel Banks never learns his lessons. And reconnaissance is one of his failures at Mansfield whenever his huge Union force gets caught by the Confederate charge of Mouton.